Well, hello, and welcome to the third day of Political Science 1010. It is Friday, the 12th of January, and we are all at home because of weather. So my hope is that we can use this process of me recording the lectures to keep us up to date on the syllabus no matter what's going on with the weather. So if you remember from our conversation on Wednesday, we were talking about how we know what kinds of governments that are in place. We talked about totalitarianism and authoritarianism, and then we defined democracy and discussed the kinds of things that are important to know when we think about American democracy and how it's different than sort of classical definitions or other kinds of ways that we can think about democracy. Today we're going to move on and talk more specifically about the American founding project. And really, we're going to do some political history as opposed to sort of general history. So a lot of this stuff will probably be pretty familiar to you, but I'm going to emphasize some things that maybe are not necessarily 100% familiar to you because I want to help us to move from this notion of the American founding and what the early revolutionaries and the framers of the Constitution were thinking to how our system works today. So how do we get from some of the problems that happened during the founding to the expectations that are laid out in the Constitution as it is? So some of the things that we need to know about in terms of thinking about the American Revolution are where the need to separate from England came from. And there's a set of issues that are going on in the colonies at that time. So the first one, and the one that we hear probably more than any other when we hear about the revolution, is this idea of taxation without representation. So this is kind of where all of the tax stuff fits in that you hear about when we talk about the beginning of the American Revolution. And the notion here is that, or at least the argument that people are making, or people were making at the time, is that the American colonies were being taxed above and beyond what people in the main part of England were being taxed. And that wasn't fair because, as they said up until the beginning of the Revolution, you know, we are also English citizens and we ought to be treated equally. And so these are things like the Stamp Act that required certain kinds of stamps to be on official documents, and the tea tax, a tax that on tea that was brought and used in the American colonies through England, right, from England's other colonies and other parts of the world. And finally, we even get to this idea of the Intolerable Acts, which is when the British government closed Boston Harbor in response to colonist boycotts and in response to the Boston Tea Party. Now, what's really going on here? Because what happens a lot of times when we talk about this is that it sort of seems like it comes out of a vacuum, right? So it almost feels like the colonists woke up one day in 1772 and said, hey, we want to be independent, but that's not what happened at all. So there's a lot of context, political context, that goes into the story about how we get to the revolution. And the first part of this is the idea of the French and Indian War. And you guys have probably heard about this in the context of the history of the United States before the revolution, or history of the colonies. But the thing is about the French and Indian War is that that is just a piece of what was a much larger conflict in Europe and other parts of the world between France and England. It's called the 7 Years' War when you talk about it in its European context. And so what was happening is that England and France were basically fighting a proxy war here in the North American continent. So here in what's now the United States and what's in southern Canada now. And it was a conflict between the British and the American colonists and the French, who were allied with the Native American tribes in much of the what's now upstate New York, southern parts of Ontario and Quebec, and that's where the fighting happened. So what's going on is that Great Britain looks around and says, you know, we had to fight more of this giant war on the North American continent. And frankly, we have taxed the people inside England a ton already. And we think that because the American colonists are British citizens, we're going to tax them too to help pay for the North American portion of this war. So that's part of the context, right? It's not just that King George III woke up one morning and said, oh, I'm going to start extracting resources from North America. It was in response to this fighting of a war that was going on both in North America and in Europe. And the other question that we can talk to or think about is, did the colonists really want representation, or what did this idea of representation really mean? There's a couple ways to think about this, because what the British Crown said was that, well, you guys do have representation, right? You have colonial legislatures, which they did. They elected representatives to legislatures in the colonies, and those legislatures interacted with the executive branch of England, with the Crown, through Crown governors. And so in that sense, they were represented to the Crown. Now, there was not a specific seat in Parliament for the North American colonies, but that was true for all of the colonies. There were not seats for any of the colonies. But it's also the case that because their system worked so differently, it was not unusual for someone who didn't live in a particular district to show up and run for Parliament for that district. So, in fact, what we know is in the early 1770s, at least 3 of the members of Parliament, possibly a few more, were actually American colonists. They were representing districts in England, but they were, in fact, North Americans. So this is kind of an interesting challenge here to think about. So what's really going on here? Well, what seems to be going on here is that many of the leadership in the American colonies, so those people who were serving in the legislatures and who were helping to make decisions about the colonies in the context of their own homes and in their own colonies, they didn't want to be interfered with by the British Crown. And that makes sense when you think about it in the longer sweep of North American history, right? Because it took a super long time to get from England to the United States. And so there had to be people on the ground who were making decisions about the administration of the colonies. And also, there's a big chunk of time in the end of the 1600s where England was fighting a civil war. And so the American colonies were kind of left on their own to do stuff. And so because they had this history and tradition of English education and expectations of sort of natural rights and parliamentarianism, they had built their own internal systems. So this is a useful thing to think about, this notion of taxation without representation, but it's not quite as straightforward as it sounds. There's other things going on in this conversation. And that becomes important when we move beyond or through the Revolutionary War and into the time when we create the Constitution, because many of these ideas and this history and expectation that the founders had moves through from the colonial period into the constitutional generation. So when we think about the political history, the things that we need to know are there's the First Continental Congress, which is called in 1774. Basically, it's only made up of 12 colonies. Georgia didn't even send a representative. The goal here is protest. What they're trying to do is to come up with a unified way to send their grievances to King George. That's really what they're doing. And up through this point, every time they communicate with the British Crown, they're always communicating as British citizens. And they say that, like, we have these rights because we are British. Not because we're Americans and we want to be free, but because we are British. And so the First Continental Congress is designed to protest. It creates a boycott of British goods in order to coerce the British government to get out of the colonies or to get off the colonies' back, but there's no intention of independence. All that the First Continental Congress did was they sent a letter of grievance to the king. They basically said, look, we're declaring the coercive acts void, and we're going to send this set of grievances of the things the king has done. We're going to boycott goods that come from England until we are given our rights. But there was no context of independence. Now, this is 1774, right? Like, the Revolutionary War is only 2 years away. So what happens? between this idea of the First Continental Congress, where they're not trying to be independent, and the Second Continental Congress when they wrote the Declaration. Well, what happens in the middle is the publishing of a pamphlet called Common Sense. So this is a pamphlet that was circulated and many people wrote, and it's by Thomas Paine. Now, he's kind of a rabble-rouser across the board. He got kicked out of England earlier for trying to get people to rally for their individual rights. But he ends up in the American colonies. He's only been here for a few years. But he writes this pamphlet where he explains what should happen, what he thinks should happen. That the American colonies should be independent because they are able to rule themselves, and that Americans should try the Republican form of government. So for many people, you may say, well, wait a minute, this dude wrote a pamphlet and handed it around, and that's why we ended up having a revolution. Well, you have to understand the context in which this happened. So one of the things to know, and an important piece of this, is that colonial America had one of the highest literacy rates in the world at the time. It was much higher than many parts of mainland Europe. So something in the neighborhood of 80 to 85% of American colonists could read. And they didn't have all sorts of the other things that we have today to entertain ourselves. And so we know that, in fact, newspaper subscription and the number of newspapers were higher in colonial America than they are today. So that's what people did, is they read stuff and information. And so pamphlets like this got circulated a lot, and they got printed in newspapers. And so a better analogy for what this was is not a pamphlet that some guy is handing out, but like a speech or an important documentary that gets shown on a bunch of different cable stations and that people download on YouTube. That's much more how Common Sense sort of filtered into people's understanding, right? So we know that there was a lot of conversation that went on about Common Sense, and we know this because of existing letters between average normal people in the colonies, not the famous people who end up, becoming the writers of the Constitution, but just average, well-educated people, of whom much of the American colonies were made up of those kind of people. So this really coalesced the thinking of the founders. And so by the time they call the Second Continental Congress, which is in May 1775, so it's even before the Declaration gets written. It's a whole year before the Declaration gets written. By May of 1775, war had actually already begun. There had already been armed conflict between colonists and British soldiers. And you guys have seen and heard tons of history about this, right? And the Boston Massacre and all of these kinds of things. If you're interested in this era and how average people dealt with the British and the British sort of occupation of much of New England, the AMC show Turn is a really fascinating look at all of this, and it does a really good job of showing kind of how the colonial army fits in and how they organize themselves, but also how these people who were either loyal to Britain or living in towns that were still loyal had to deal with the conflict. So the Second Continental Congress declared independence, right? And this is through the Declaration of Independence, which was issued on July 4th, right, of 1776. And they decided that the only way to ensure their rights as people was to separate from England. Now, normally at this point I would show you a clip from the John Adams miniseries that went on HBO about 10 years ago, but I'm going to put it as a link underneath this video so you can watch it at the end of the lecture. So the Declaration of Independence was written by the people in that Second Continental Congress. It was primarily drafted by Thomas Jefferson. He wrote it, and it was amended in many ways by the Continental Congress. And you'll see that when you watch the John Adams clip. Basically, what Jefferson does in the Declaration is he lays out the basis for separation. Basically, their natural law, and all men are created equal, right? He says that a number of times, with the idea being that the colonists' right, they have a natural right to govern themselves. And so it lays out a set of grievances against the king for a whole variety of tyrannies, but particularly that he had violated his contract with the people. Of course, the king didn't know that he had made one, right? The king thought he was ruling because God wanted him to be the king of England. But what you see here in particular in this laying out of the grievances, in saying that the king has violated his contract, is a sort of a strain of political thought and British political thought, and more importantly, but what becomes American political thought, of the notion of the social contract, that people who are in governing positions are only there because those who they are ruling, the people, have agreed to them doing it, and so that they both form a contract. That the people agree to obey the laws, and the government agrees to rule the people justly. One of the other important practical needs of the Congress that show up in this declaration are that the United States, the new country, needed foreign recognition. It needed outside aid, and the Declaration gave some basis for other countries to help and to not be seen as interfering with the internal affairs of Great Britain. Right? So think about it from the perspective of, say, France or some other country, to say, well, this is an argument between England and its colony. Right? By stating in the Declaration of Independence that the United States is a separate country, then France has the sort of cover to say, okay, well, we can give you money, we can lend you money, we can give you arms and things like that without necessarily restarting their conflict with England. So that's also another important piece and necessity of the Declaration. Now, the thing is that, at least in terms of the politics and in terms of how government is set up, we're just kind of jumping over the actual fighting of the Revolutionary War. Because what's important for us is to understand how the colonies and then the states organized themselves as a new country. So the important thing to know is that there is fighting on U.S. soil, as it becomes, until March of 1781. Right, so the last battle of the war, the Revolutionary War, isn't ended until 1781, and General Cornwallis's defeat at Yorktown. So what's happening during that time, right? That's a 5-year time frame in which the colonies are trying to act as their own country. So they have to have some way to coordinate, and that type of coordination was called the Articles of Confederation. This was the first version of an organization of the national government. And so really, at the end of the day, this does qualify as a constitution, right? Because a constitution is something that sets up a government. It lays out rules and institutions for running a nation. And so in that sense, the Articles of Confederation are a constitution, or at least a small c constitution. The United States Constitution gets written later on. We'll talk about that in a minute. So the Articles of Confederation are drafted in November of 1777. Basically, this is still the Continental Congress operating as a decision-making body and saying, look, we need some way to coordinate. We can't fight this war without coordination. So it's not fully ratified by all 13 of the states until March of 1781. Colonists realized they had to do this, but the reality is that the ways the Articles of Confederation set up the relationship really made it difficult for the colonies to join together as a body and fight the war. And so we'll talk through what the implications are of that and how that pushed people toward the eventual drafting of the Constitution. So what's going on? Well, the Articles of Confederation are about fear in a lot of ways, right? Because what's happening? The colonists are looking around and saying, we're trying to separate from England. England is oppressing us by making us do things we don't want to do. And so much of the articles reflect this fear of tyranny, fear of an ability of a strong central government to make the states do things that they don't want to do. And so the Articles of Confederation was set up as a group of states together. So it gave a preferential treatment for the states, for the state governments, as opposed to a national or collective government. And it did not have a powerful executive. Why? Because they were afraid of that. They were afraid of a king or an executive being too powerful. And they were afraid of the states, one state, particularly Virginia or New York, because those were the two largest states at the time. They were afraid of those two states getting preferential treatment over the other states. And so what the articles create is what they called a League of Friendship. And this League of Friendship among the colonies had some important rules that impacted how they could make decisions. The first one is that they required unanimity in decisions among the states, meaning that all the states had to agree. There had to be unanimous decision making. So if even one state could overturn something because they didn't want it to happen, no matter how large or how small the state was. So that was an important piece of this to help protect from the fear of tyranny. The second part of this League of Friendship is there's basically no enforcement mechanisms going on in these articles. So there's no power outside the constituting states. There's no way for the national government to tell the states to do something. And the interesting thing is that the combination of this lack of enforcement power and a lack of revenue base, why? Because states had the power to tax, the national government didn't, and the national government had to ask states for money. They couldn't require the states to give them money. This is what happened at Valley Forge. Right, so we think about this Revolutionary War, and we think about, these patriots fighting, and we see these paintings of Washington and the patriots at Valley Forge, and what a hard winter it was, and nobody had shoes and all this. It's because of politics. It's not, we sort of think about Valley Forge in a vacuum, like it was somehow just this horrible winter that happened during the Revolution. But no, what was going on there is that the national government, through the Articles of Confederation, didn't have the power to require states to help pay for the soldiers. And so Washington could not requisition new stuff. He couldn't ask the national government for boots. He could tell the national government he needed boots, and the national government could tell the states that they needed boots, but there was no way to compel money to buy those boots. And so that's why there's the suffering at Valley Forge that winter. And so that's really when people realized that there was a challenge. So what happens? Well, the national government did have powers of what they called external administration, which meant that it had the power to raise and outfit an army. Of course, it didn't have the power to pay for that army, but it had the power to say, we need this many soldiers. Now, in the end, no one could agree, and Congress finally told the states they had to outfit their own soldiers, and so that these military groups ended up being linked to states. But the national government had the power to raise a military. It did have some external political power, so it could make treaties with other countries. And it had the power over trade between the colonies or between the United States and other countries. So how does that translate into a solution? Well, honestly, what ended up happening is that we borrowed a lot of money from the Dutch, actually. We borrowed huge amounts of money, the national government did, from the Dutch in order to help outfit the military because they couldn't get the states to agree. And so this debt carried by the national government, and in fact, debt that was carried by the states, because some of those states also borrowed money from the French and from the Dutch in order to help give guns and boots and tents to the Revolutionary War soldiers, meant that we came out of the Revolutionary War with this sort of loose confederation government with very little power, but a whole lot of debt all over the place. And so that's a really important piece of the puzzle when we start moving on to talk about the Constitution. So, failures of the Articles. There's a lot of problems with these. Now, we understand why they happened and why they were set up the way they were, right? Remember, there's existing legislatures inside the states from colonial days. So they had this apparatus of power and decision making inside the states, and they were really afraid of national power. They were afraid of oppression from a national government. So those things make sense, but they made it very difficult for the American government to function. So the first way we think about this, or the first thing we can talk about, is the idea of the prisoner's dilemma. There's no way to compel the other person to do what they're supposed to do. And so your best strategy is always to default, is to always do the thing that helps you without helping everybody else. And that's the nature of the prisoner's dilemma. Maybe the better way to think about this is that, think about it in terms of a tragedy of the commons, right? So what's this theoretical idea? It's the idea that if everybody owns something, no one takes care of it because they assume that somebody else will take care of it. And if there's no rules in place that require people to do things, then that's what will happen. And that's basically what happened with the national government, right? There's no enforcement mechanism. There's no way for the national government to raise money or to really even have any kind of relationship with individual citizens. It all goes through the state. And so the states were afraid that other states would get more stuff than they would. And so they wouldn't give their sort of full allotment of taxes to the national government because they were afraid that other people wouldn't give their full allotment. So Pennsylvania was afraid that Virginia wouldn't pay all it was supposed to. So Pennsylvania didn't pay as much as it should. And then Virginia didn't pay as much as it should because it knew Pennsylvania wasn't paying as much as it should, and so on and so forth. It also sets up a situation where there's a significant amount of what we call the tyranny of the majority. There's not a whole lot of protections for individual rights. Some of the states had them, but not all of them did. And so the federal government, the national government, didn't have a way to sort of help figure out what's going on if the citizens of one state didn't like what the state government was doing. And that becomes really, really obvious in that period between the end of the Revolutionary War in 1781 and when they begin to write the Constitution, which is in 1787. So there's a lot of turmoil inside the states after the Revolutionary War. Why? Well, because of war debt is part of this, both the national debt and the state level debt. So remember, think about how we deal with debt in modern America, right? The federal government has debt, and you borrow that debt from banks, and the federal government issues bonds to help pay that debt. Well, think about what's going on here, though. The states have debt. The states are also the only ones that can create banks. So what they're doing is they're creating banks to help pay the debt to Europe by printing money. Well, what happens when you print a lot of money? You have huge amounts of inflation. And so what that means, or what happens when you have huge amounts of inflation, is that while today a loaf of bread may cost $1, a week from now it may cost $10. And so then all of a sudden, if my income or my wealth doesn't increase by tenfold by next week, which it probably won't, then I'm much poorer next week because everything costs much more. The state governments so tried to deal with this by creating redistributive policies to help poor farmers, which made the wealthy angry because the argument was basically, well, there are more farmers than wealthy townspeople, at least in the colonies or in the early republic at this point. And so the idea here is that state governments couldn't protect themselves from the tyranny of the majority. They were going to get voted out of power if they didn't give farmers more stuff. The straw that breaks the camel's back is called Shays' Rebellion. So Shays' Rebellion is a perfect example of what happens under a weak government. So poor farmers from western Massachusetts marched on a federal armory in protest of their farms being foreclosed on. Who was foreclosing on those farms? The banks that the state governments had created and whom those farmers had borrowed money from to help plant crops because of inflation. You see the circular problem that's going on here. So they clashed with the state militia. They took over a federal armory. So what's an armory? It's a place where the government stores guns and ammunition. Well, they couldn't, there weren't federal troops, there were only state militias. And so these farmers basically had a armed clash with the Massachusetts state militia. So this showed how precarious this new experiment in democracy was, and showed a need for a stronger central government to protect the citizens from rebellion and violence. So why is that coming out of Shays' rebellion? Well, because the farmers beat the state militias, and they were going to be able to basically take over the state state government and have a military style coup. What was about to happen, until some other states stepped in and basically negotiated with the farmers and helped put down that rebellion. So this was a huge challenge, and they realized we have to have a stronger central government. There has to be more power in the central government to help states in these kind of situations, but also to help protect citizens from the kinds of things that can happen when the tyranny of the majority gets out of hand. So that's kind of setting the stage for our conversation next week about where the Constitution comes from and the kinds of provisions that are in the Constitution that are well explained by this series of events leading up to it. So go ahead and watch the 2 clips from the John Adams mini-series that I'm going to post after this video. If you have any questions, please send me an email, and you will get at least one more announcement about the book situation once I have the codes for the online books. So thanks a lot, and I hope you have a good day. Stay safe, stay warm, and I will see you on Wednesday the 17th.